we will start the hearing. First of all, I'd like to thank all the people who have come as witnesses and the committee members. So with me here today is Chair of Assembly Utilities and Commerce Committee, Anthony Rendon, Chair of Das Williams, who is Chair of the Natural Resources Committee, and our Chair of the Veterans Committee, Jackie Irwin. So thank you all for being here, and they're also members of this select committee. What I'm here for today is to talk about how we reach a very important goal that the governor has set, that we already have, I think, substantial, at least on the Democratic side, substantial buy-in, which is how do we get to using 50% less fuels in transportation by 2030. And it's fine to set a goal, but the real question is, what do we really have to do to reach the goal? And a lot of that work is being done by E3, which is the home organization of our first presenter. So she will go through what it is that we would have to do to get there. And then the toughest question is, how do we get there? Would you have to subsidize the cost of the vehicles? What technologies are really ready? Where are we on electric? And do we have enough charging stations? Where are we on hydrogen fuels? Is that technology ready? Where are we on biofuels? There's a competition, people feel, between food and fuel. And are we making prices of food too expensive when we look at biofuels? Or can we find a way not to compete? So these are all tremendous questions. And we don't have answers for them yet, and we won't have answers at the end of this, but at least we can start the dialogue and get an idea of what it is that we would have to do. So I will now hand this over to the other members of the committee who are here to make any opening statements they would like to make.
Well, I just want to thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me to sit on this committee and just look forward to the discussion of this very timely subject.
Okay, and Mr. Williams?
Well, as someone that believes very strongly in a sort of all of the above strategy for cleaning up our transportation infrastructure, I'm very interested to look at what things we can do in both policy arenas, budget and economic arenas to clean up our transportation fuel infrastructure.
I want to thank you as well for calling us together. My district has been particularly impacted by the use of by this issue. The center of the district lies about 10 miles from the Port of Los Angeles, 12 miles from the Port of Los Angeles. Tremendous amount of truck traffic and intersected by freeways. So clean air issues are central to some of the most salient problems in our district. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Very good. Thank you, members. All right, I will now introduce our first speaker. So Amber Mahone, or is it Mahoney?
Mahone, that's right.
Mahone is the Director of Climate Policy Analysis at Energy and Environmental Economics, known as E3. Amber is a San Francisco-based, the E3 is a San Francisco-based consulting firm. Ms. Mahone has expertise in energy and greenhouse gas policy. Since joining E3 in 2007, she's managed projects ranging from an evaluation of a higher renewable portfolio standard in California to multi-sector analysis of long-term greenhouse gas reduction pathways. She helped design the electricity sector greenhouse gas analysis used by the California Public Utility Commission in 2008 and managed the California Pathways long-term greenhouse gas reduction scenario analysis with the state's energy agencies, which has since become the beginning point for our journey here to lower greenhouse gases in 2030. So a very important study, and the original 50-50-50, 50% reduction in building energy use, 50% reduction in fuel use, and 50% reduction, or a 50% renewable portfolio came out of that study. Ms. Mahone previously worked at the IMF, International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., and holds a master's in public administration from Princeton and a BA in international relations from Wellesley College. Ms. Mahone, please begin. And if you could hold your presentation to about 10 minutes so we have lots of time for questions.
Great. Thank you, Assemblymember Quirk, for inviting me. It's great to be here. I had a slide deck that I wanted to walk through. I think this will hopefully give some of the big picture context for long-term greenhouse gas reductions and long-term reductions in fossil fuel consumption in California. I don't necessarily have all the answers of the near-term activities that we would need to do to get there. Think of this more as a focus on what technologies would be necessary in the long run.
And if the members have quick questions, feel free to turn on your microphone and ask a quick question, and then we'll get into the longer questions as we go on. But if there's something in a slide that's not clear or, acronyms, et cetera, please ask quick. Ask as soon as you have the question, because everybody else won't know the acronym either.
Yes, I apologize in advance for any acronyms that are not defined. So just a quick background on the study that makes up the analysis that you'll see here. We were asked to evaluate the... Sorry?
You're starting with a plethora of acronyms.
That's true. Although these are California acronyms that you may be familiar with. We worked on this project with the California Air Resources Board, the ARB, the California Independent System Operator, the CalISO, the Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC, and the California Energy Commission, the CEC. And we were asked to evaluate the feasibility and cost of a range of greenhouse gas reduction scenarios in California with a focus on 2030, but in the context of meeting the state's long-term 2050 greenhouse gas reduction goals. And I'll just mention that we developed these scenarios prior to the development of the governor's 2015 climate and energy goals that he announced. So you'll see they're not exactly aligned with those because they were developed independently of those. And there's a link if you're interested in seeing more about this study. So just cutting to the chase in terms of the big picture economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction results that we found, we see that under current policy, which is the reference case, this black dotted line, we expect that current policy will achieve the legislatively mandated 2020 target of bringing emissions back to 1990 levels by 2020. But in the absence of additional policies, greenhouse gas emissions remain relatively flat and slightly increase out to 2050 just due to population growth and the like. So additional policies are needed to bring emissions down. We evaluated a variety of low-carbon scenarios, all of which meet the 2050 goal, which is an 80% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050. But they get there on different paths, using different technologies and different implementation, different adoption rates of technologies. So we kind of group these into technology scenarios and timing scenarios.
Wait, could you go back and do the acronyms on the slide?
Oh, yes. So we look at, I'll just talk about the scenarios really quickly. We look at a straight line scenario, which is reflective of sort of current policies and current thinking of how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions more rapidly. So it includes 50% renewable energy by 2030. It includes a mix of battery electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles. It includes significant amounts of liquid biofuels, higher energy efficiency, and the like. We vary those sort of basic assumptions.
Which line then?
The green line is the straight line scenario here. And so, and I'll zoom in on the 2030 results in a minute.
So the green dotted line.
Yeah, it's a solid line. This green solid line.
Green
right
solid line. Okay.
Yeah. The low carbon gas scenario, all of the technology scenarios have very similar carbon reduction trajectories. The low carbon gas scenario, rather than doing liquid biofuels, does biogas and synthetic methane to displace natural gas use. The high battery electric vehicle scenario, that's what BEV stands for, is battery electric vehicles. That scenario includes more battery electric vehicles and no fuel cell vehicles. And then the distributed energy scenario has higher rooftop solar. And then the CCS scenario here, that stands for carbon capture and sequestration. So rather than focusing on renewable energy, that scenario includes carbon capture and sequestration as the way to reduce emissions from the electricity sector. And then the delayed deployment and early deployment scenarios have either slower or faster adoption of low carbon technologies, particularly electrification in buildings and electrification of vehicles. So just zooming in on the 2030 results, what we find is that all of these low carbon scenarios hit the 2050 goal, but get there in a different way in 2030. So the slower adoption scenario gets to a 26% reduction relative to 1990 levels by 2030. The straight line scenario gets to 33%, and the early adoption or faster deployment scenario gets to a 38% reduction, which is about 9 million tons away from the 40% reduction goal, so, or 2%.
Okay. So what's the difference between the three lines? Are they the same technologies, but just greater adoption?
Yes, that's mostly correct. And I'll show a little bit about how these scenarios vary in terms of the transportation sector assumptions. All of them have a mix of battery electric and fuel cell vehicles. The faster deployment or the early deployment scenario includes a heavier focus on CNG vehicles in the 2030 timeframe in the medium duty and heavy, in particular in the medium duty fleet.
And what's the dotted line for?
The dotted line is just a visual cue to connect the dots between the 2020 target and the 2050 target. So that shows what a linear trajectory between those two goals would be.
And so you're basically asking that on all three of these that we go further in 2020 than currently planned.
Because we're below the 2020 goal
Yes.
here? Yeah, that's right. And that's due to an early focus on energy efficiency measures. In these early years. That's right.
Okay.
Okay, so now I wanted to focus in on the transportation sector results specifically. What I just showed you is economy-wide. So the topic before us, the question asked was what would be needed to achieve a 50% reduction in petroleum use by 2030. So I took a look at what our scenarios implied. And so this is the percent reduction in transportation sector petroleum use relative to 2015. And you can see that the reference scenario, which you recall is current policies, gets to an 18% reduction by 2030. And those are things that are already on the book. So that's basically the achievement of the Pavley standards, which have since been become federal regulation to improve the fuel economy of vehicles. Then our low carbon scenarios span the range from 29% reduction to 55% reduction in petroleum use by 2030. And I'll show on the subsequent slides kind of how we get there. But it's a combination of faster adoption of zero-emission vehicles, which is what ZEV stands for, increase in biofuels, some use of compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas, and smart growth, which is leads to reductions in vehicle miles traveled. So this slide shows the number of zero-emission vehicles on the road in these scenarios by the year 2030. And it's really a dramatic increase from where we are today, which I think is in the hundreds of thousands of zero-emission vehicles on the road in California. So we got to 6 to 8 million zero-emission vehicles and plug-in emission vehicles in these scenarios, which represents 50 to 60% of new light-duty sales are some form of zero-emission vehicle by 2030. So really a dramatic increase.
So would you define FCV, BEV, PHEV, and explain what you mean by zero-emission vehicle?
Sure. So a zero-emission vehicle is defined here as one of these three vehicle types, which is a fuel cell vehicle, FCV, a battery electric vehicle, BEV, or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, PHEV. This figure shows what's happening in the medium and heavy-duty fleet. And the first thing I'll point out here is that the axis here is different than what you saw on the previous slide. These are now thousands of vehicles, whereas in the light-duty fleet, we're talking about millions of vehicles. So when we talk about the transportation sector in California, about 70% of that is the light-duty fleet. So really an important source of energy use in California and emissions is gasoline use in light-duty vehicles. But that's not to say that the medium and heavy-duty fleet doesn't matter. It's just much smaller relative to light-duty vehicles. So here we're getting in the range of 150,000 zero-emission vehicles, 300,000 zero-emission vehicles in a low-carbon gas scenario. The early deployment scenario has this big push on compressed natural gas vehicles, which is the blue bar there. And that's assumed to be mostly to meet air quality goals in the South Coast and the San Joaquin Air Management District. And those CNG vehicles need to be phased out by 2050 to hit the 2050 greenhouse gas reduction goals. So just digging in a little bit deeper into what this reduction in petroleum use means in terms of fuel use. This chart shows the change in energy demand in the transportation sector from 2015 to 2050 in the straight line scenario. The units here are in exajoules, which is a bit of a wonky energy unit, but for context, that's 7.6 billion gallons of gasoline equivalent, so about 20 billion gallons of gasoline equivalent that we're using today in California for all of our transportation uses. As I mentioned before, gasoline is really the dominant share of our energy use in the transportation sector. In the straight line scenario, you see that being phased out pretty dramatically. And a lot of that through this 2025 timeframe is due to existing emission performance standards for vehicles and the federal CAFE standards. It's also due to the increase in battery electric and fuel cell vehicles. But the other thing that I wanted to point out here is really this green wedge here that comes in, and that is renewable diesel fuel, which in the straight line scenario is displacing about 60% of diesel consumption by 2030. And between those two effects, the reduction in gasoline and then this reduction in diesel, that is what gets us to the 42% reduction in petroleum use that we see in this scenario. So just kind of to wrap up this, I wanted to talk a little bit about technology risks. And One of the key findings from our study is that there's multiple pathways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's not just one single technology or one single way to get there. And that's shown in these 3 different scenarios that you'll see here, the straight line scenario, the high battery electric vehicle scenario, and the low carbon gas scenario. All of them rely on low carbon sustainably sourced biomass to reduce emissions, but they use that biomass in different ways. So in the straight line scenario, and in the high BEV scenario, that's used to produce liquid biofuels. In the low carbon gas scenario, we use most of the biomass to produce biogas. So there's different technologies required there. In the cases where you see an NA, that means that the technology is not deployed in that scenario. So the thing to focus on is that many of these technologies pertain to the transportation sector. That's an area where there's probably been less commercialization of low-carbon technologies than, for example, in the electricity sector, where we have a lot more experience with things like solar and wind and hydropower. So many of the technology risks, this would be an area to focus research and development efforts, for example, to help commercialize the technologies that are needed to reduce emissions. I also wanted to touch briefly on costs from our analysis. So in the pathways model, I just want to describe how we measure costs. We talk about the incremental cost of energy infrastructure. So it's the difference in cost between a reference technology, what we're already going to do given today's policies, and a low-carbon technology. And then we also measure the changes in fuel costs. What we're not measuring when I talk about costs are societal cost impacts like climate benefits of reduced criteria pollutants or societal benefits from reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And we also aren't looking at structural or macroeconomic impacts to the economy. So this slide shows the average household costs in 2030, and they come to about $8 per month per household in the straight line scenario. And that's the net cost, that's the incremental cost relative to what we would have been doing anyways. And you'll see that a lot of the savings that we get are coming from reduced spending on gasoline and diesel. So you're not going to the pump to fill up your car at the gas station anymore because you're driving a zero-emission vehicle. That's a huge savings to the average household. There's an increase in other costs, though, that offset those savings. An increase in the electricity bill because you're both buying more electricity and it costs a bit more. There's an increase in your car payment because the zero-emission vehicle is slightly more expensive than the alternative. I should mention, this is assuming no subsidies for any of these technologies. And then there's also an increase in the fuel costs. So the net of those comes to about $8 per month per household. If we assume that all other costs to the commercial and industrial sectors flow through to households, that increases to about $14 per month per household in 2030. The next slide shows trucking and bus costs. And it's a similar story here, but without the impact of electricity and natural gas. This is basically the trucking industry sees savings from reduced expenditures on fossil fuels and an increase in cost of zero-emission fuels and zero-emission vehicles. And so the average is about $26 per month per vehicle in 2030, which is about 1.7% increase over the reference scenario energy costs. This is a statewide average, so it's not specific to any particular vehicle fleet, but it gives a sense of the magnitude. So finally, I just want to, go ahead.
Slide. So which one is the cost savings and which one is the cost
Yeah, great question. So the line through the center here shows zero net cost. So anything to the left, these negative numbers represent cost savings, and anything to the right represents an incremental cost increase. So you see the fuel costs, gasoline and diesel. Those costs are being avoided, so that's savings, and then there's an increase in fuel costs. So if you add together these three costs for vehicles, zero-emission vehicle fuel, and fuel savings, you get to the net cost, which is that's
Cost figure is that
yeah,
per month per vehicle.
that's right. And then the error bars that you see here, this shows a range of outcomes given higher or lower fuel prices, which are very uncertain and drive a lot of these results. So there's a large amount of uncertainty in any of these cost forecasts. So I just wanted to wrap up by mentioning that the transportation sector is hugely important in California. I think it represents about 40% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the state today. But it's not the only piece of the puzzle. What we need is really progress across all sectors of the economy if we're going to meet the 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. That means we need to increase efficiency and conservation both in buildings and in vehicles, switch to lower carbon fuels, electricity or hydrogen, again, both in vehicles and buildings, reduce the emissions intensity of our electricity, and reduce the emissions intensity of our liquid and gaseous fuels through the use of biofuels or synthetic fuels. So just my last slide, we found that a 50% reduction in petroleum use relative to today is consistent with at least one of the pathways that we evaluated, which comes close to reducing greenhouse gases 40% relative to 1990. It's not the only pathway, though, so not all of our low-carbon scenarios get to this 50% reduction. There's key uncertainties in future driving patterns. The Air Resources Board recently released some new transportation data, which actually makes this story a lot more positive because it has lower estimates of transportation energy consumption, lower estimates of transportation emissions. And that new data is not yet incorporated into this analysis. But even regardless of that new data, I think our fundamental findings wouldn't change, which is that to reduce petroleum use, we need to focus on fuel economy standards and reducing vehicle miles traveled in vehicles, particularly light duty, achieving rapid adoption of zero-emission vehicles, again, particularly in the light-duty vehicle fleet, and then scaling up sustainable biofuels or biogas. And as Assemblymember Quirk mentioned, there's a big difference between sustainable biofuels and biofuels that may displace food crops. So all of those strategies will be critically important. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very exciting and comprehensive view, and I really appreciate your work. I'd like to introduce Assemblymember Chow, Chair of the Housing Committee, and certainly housing is going to be a very important, how we build future housing, how we retrofit new housing is a very important factor in how we'll look at things in the future in terms of meeting any greenhouse gas reduction goals. Assemblymember Chow, would you like to say anything?
I just want to thank all the presenters for being here today. I look forward to your testimonies, and I apologize for being late because I was in a different committee for a bill presentation. So thanks very much.
All right. And again, I want to thank everyone for being here. So I have some questions, and I could probably I'll limit my questions to 5 minutes. So let's see how quickly we can get through them. For renewable biodiesel, is that something that we can really scale up U.S.-wide and worldwide? So traditionally we think about things like cattle carcasses as grease, etc., as the source of these renewable biofuels. Is there really going to be enough of it that this is more than a California solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this analysis, we've restricted the use of biomass to the U.S. resource, and then assumed that California has access to about its population-weighted share of that resource. So we're not assuming big imports, for example, of biofuels. We're also assuming new technologies are used to produce the biodiesel that we model in this case. So we're actually assuming that you gasify the biomass to produce liquid renewable diesel, not using manure or tallow, basically cow fat, to produce the renewable diesel.
How do you get it again? Where is it coming from?
So it would come from feedstocks like woody waste, switchgrass, other corn stover, and the like. We're not assuming food crops in any of these cases.
Oh, great!
So we relied on a study called the Department of Energy put together called the Billion Ton Study, where they tried to estimate what the sustainable biomass resource would be in the United States.
All right. I'll just make a comment that we had the diesel manufacturers in here, the diesel engine manufacturers, who talked about a 50% reduction. Half of that coming from simply having vehicles, both the cab and the trailer, that were very aerodynamic, and then the other half coming from engine efficiencies, basically making more use of the waste heat, and that it's fascinating. We'll see how far that gets. I don't expect you to necessarily be able to comment right now. Heavy-duty electric, I've been told that that's not likely to be, that so much of our transport is over long distances, and you're talking about moving a lot of tons, that's not likely to be a useful scenario. What is your appraisal of it?
Yeah, so we do not assume fully electric long-haul trucking in this analysis. We do have some diesel hybrid vehicles for long-haul trucking, but from what we've seen, that does not seem to be a solution in the 2030 timeframe.
All right. If you had to pick a most likely scenario to get there, and would you be looking at the sort of 6 to 8 million vehicles of plug-in hybrid electrics and just simple electric vehicles? What would you look at as the most likely scenario to get to that point?
Well, what I think we really need are policies that are robust to uncertainties in the technology development space. Mm-hmm. And precisely because I don't know, for example, whether fuel cell vehicles or battery electric vehicles will achieve greater market share, I'd like to see California promoting strategies that would be kind of open to either outcome.
All right. Thank you. So I've reached my time limit. I'd like to introduce Assemblymember Richard Bloom. Assemblymember Bloom is in charge of Budget Sub 3, and everybody loves Budget Sub 3 because it has the cap and trade money. And they've spent it 3 times already, by the way. We all have our favorite projects. I don't think mine got in the budget, but maybe next year. Assemblymember Bloom, would you like to make any opening remarks? All right. So, further questions from the group? Well, thank you very much. Again, E3 was a real pioneer in this work. And at our next panels, we'll be talking about the different technologies and where they are and where they're going. So thank you very much, Ms. Mahone, and thanks for all the great work you and E3 have done. So our next panel, I will introduce